all I can acknowledge is what the intelligence shows, right? I only know the intelligence community has zero evidence that someone has flipped, that a foreign power flipped a vote in 2020, 22, or 24.
And so the 2020 election was, in fact, the results as we, the American public.
I'm still researching, so let me. This is the first.
But there's no intelligence.
Not yet.
There is no intelligence that the election would have said that Donald Trump was president.
The president said that tonight.
It is the narrative version of the Titanic hitting the iceberg. It's Donald Trump's own election conspiracy guy, John Solomon, who can't even pretend that his investigation into the 2020 election turned up the claims of election fraud that Donald Trump said they did, that he was desperately seeking. That was the night of his national address. It is part of a pattern now, an embarrassing pattern of incompetence from the Trump administration to find something that they try to market as a gotcha, a bombshell, declassified memo that either wittingly or unwittingly proves something else, usually the opposite. The latest example of that pattern goes back to the very beginning of Trump's first year in office the first time, and his push still now, 10 years later, to rewrite the history of the Russia investigation into his campaign. The New York Times reports this. Quote, in recent weeks, the White House has released a trove of previously classified FBI memos that it says back up Trump's claims that a so-called deep state was out to get him, in which there is, quote, little new of substance in the documents and nothing that fundamentally undercuts the FBI's rationale for pursuing the Russia investigation. But the Times reveals that the material does do something else. It sheds new light on how an entire half of the FBI's original investigation, the part that was supposed to go back and look into Trump's ties to Russia, was effectively killed from the start by then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. From that reporting, quote, Rosenstein did not ask Special Counsel Robert Mueller to conduct the counterintelligence investigation into Donald Trump and made clear to Mueller that he did not want him conducting an open-ended, years-long investigation. Quote, although Rosenstein did not authorize Mueller to conduct the counterintelligence investigation, responsibility for overseeing it was transferred to the FBI agents working on Mueller's team, according to the memos released by the White House. But since the special counsel's mandate was to focus on crimes, the counterintelligence focus fell by the wayside and was limited to activities within the scope of the special counsel's jurisdiction, according to one of the memos. I want to bring in the reporter behind that story, New York Times investigative journalist Mike Schmidt. Director Brennan is still with us. Mike, just first, what did the Trump White House think the memos were going to show? And then explain how this falls through the cracks, how they end up releasing something that really points at one of the things Donald Trump has been running from for a decade.
It seems like they wanted the memos to back up the notion that the deep state was out to get Donald Trump and to further the idea that the Russia, what happened around Russia was a hoax and it was a conspiracy against Trump. And it's one that they believe so much in that there's a criminal investigation going on in Florida into it. This can easily get very confusing, so let me try and make it as basic as possible. In May of 2017, the FBI, after the Comey firing, was so concerned that Donald Trump was potentially acting at the behest of Russia that they took this extraordinary decision, a decision that I still find hard to get my head around. They opened an investigation into whether Trump was a counterintelligence threat, whether he was being used by the Russians. That in of itself is an extraordinary thing. For a range of things that happened behind the scenes, that investigation is never done in the way that the FBI thought it should be done when they opened it in May of 2017. And if you went back to 2017 or 2018 and you told the average American that Robert Mueller's investigation is not really looking at Trump's personal history and ties to Russia, it's exclusively focused on whether crimes were committed, I think people would be, surprised that the Mueller investigation never took a true deep dive at Trump's own ties to Russia outside of the 2016 campaign.
Do you think Trump is under the notion that this investigation into him is happening, that that's why he's such a lunatic about it 10 years later?
I don't know. I mean, look, you have to remember, after Mueller is appointed in May or June or July of 17, I interviewed Trump in the Oval Office, and Maggie Haberman asked him whether Mueller would be crossing a red line if he looked at his finances. And he said, yes, he would be. And what the FBI wanted to do, one person once described to me at some point in the past decade, was a Manhattan Project style investigation into Trump's finances to understand where Trump had gotten his money from. Now, there are people on both ends of the political spectrum who will have varying different views of that. Some people, some strong Article 2 people that would think that the executive branch can't do an investigation like that because the president sets what the national security threats are. So how can you investigate whether the president is a national security threat? So like the idea of the counterintelligence investigation is a extraordinary one, and one that can be easily debated. But at the end of the day, Trump did make clear that he didn't want his finances looked at. And that Manhattan Project style financial investigation into Trump's ties to Russia, based on everything we know today, a decade later, never happened.
Director Brennan, you're gone, right, before this decision is made. This happens after Trump fires Comey. But Trump is still intent on investigating you. That's what the Southern District of Florida is looking at, for simply assessing that either wittingly or unwittingly, there were shared priorities, if you will, looking at Hillary Clinton's emails and otherwise. What do you make of the fact that last week they dumped memos that show something very different than what they seem to think they show? Why this obsession, in your view?
Well, I think once something gets into Donald Trump's head, he can't get rid of it, particularly when he is so insecure and is so sensitive about any type of perceived, chink in his armor that the Russians had helped him get elected back in 2016. So it's unsurprising that he continues to pull at this, and also it's part of his way to retaliate against individuals that he thinks wronged him. But I must say, John Solomon, he has raised buffoonery to a never before seen level in terms of what it is that he says and pushes out as far as these conspiracy theories are concerned. But like Mike, I do believe that there are a number of threads on the financial front and the counterintelligence front that were being pulled in the early part of 2017, but then stopped. And so I still don't think that we understand fully all of the potential connections that people around Donald Trump or Donald Trump had to Russians. And as you pointed out, the Russians are a very sophisticated intelligence service, and they suborn and recruit people wittingly and unwittingly. And that was the concern I think the FBI had. Was Donald Trump and the people around him, given that there were so many oddities in terms of the campaign, as well as then shortly after the election, the contacts that were taking place between Russians and those close to Donald Trump, I think the FBI had an obligation. They had a responsibility to make sure that they understood exactly what the Russians might be doing, even if it was unbeknownst to the individuals involved.